Well, boss, you told me to try to catch potential customers using the net. So I am. Cody, what should you have done? I should have used Squarespace.
In 1955, an 18-year-old boy named James Maury Henson was hard at work in his parents' living room. He hovered over a small table on which he had placed an assortment of materials. There were sewing tools, glue, an old felt coat that had once belonged to his mother, and one ping-pong ball. He took the tattered coat, now in a pile of separate pieces, and stitched together a long tube, just big enough for an arm. On this, he placed two smaller pieces of cloth, tacked his two arms on a body. He created a triangular head and jaw, big enough for his large hand to operate. Finally, he cut the ping-pong ball in half, gluing the pieces to either side of the head and marking both with large black slash circles. He then put his hand through the bottom of the puppet, turning it to face him. What was moments ago just felt and string, Jim Henson had given character. Kermit was alive.
Hello there. My name is Jim Henson, and I'm a puppeteer. I'm called a puppeteer because I work with puppets.
Okay, you're going to love this story. Greatest story in the world.
Hey, thank you, and welcome again to another Muppet Show.
Jim Henson was born on September 24, 1936, in Greenville, Mississippi. He was the youngest son of Paul and Betty Henson. His father's work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture forced Jim, his mother, and his older brother, Paul Jr., to move back and forth between Mississippi and Maryland, eventually moving for the final time in 1948, landing just outside of the University of Maryland in a home in University Park. Jim loved music, and he would often sing with his brother as his mother played an old organ. The family owned various songbooks with which Jim would become familiar, such as A.A. Milne's songbook featuring a few personal favorites of Jim, Halfway Down the Stairs and Cottleston Pie. Jim's creativity was always encouraged by his grandmother, Dear, who clearly saw something special in the young boy. Throughout their childhood, Jim and Paul Jr. would spend the majority of their time together, often tinkering and building things such as model airplanes and radios. Jim loved to listen to the radios with which he worked, especially tuning into radio dramas. However, his love for radio would be overshadowed by the rise of a new invention, a device that would change his life, and a machine that he would use to change the world. At the age of 13, Jim Henson heard of television. He begged his parents to buy him a set, and they would a year later in 1950. Jim was enamored with TV, consuming as much as he could throughout his teenage years. He was exposed to some of the most innovative comedy performances of the day, with stars such as Ernie Kovacs and Milton Berle making a strong impression on the young boy. In high school, Jim joined a school's drama club, where he took time performing and building sets, although he heavily favored the latter. As his high school career progressed, his love for television grew, and his yearning to be a part of it intensified. He planned to attend the University of Maryland in the fall of 1954, hoping to study set design, and throughout his senior year, he began looking for ways to break into the television industry. When his local CBS station, WTOP, posted positions for their new program, The Junior Morning Show, specifically asking for young puppeteers, Jim was thrilled. There was only one problem. He knew nothing about puppetry. Despite this, Jim jumped on the opportunity, checking out 2 books on the performance medium from his local library. These books taught him not only how to operate a puppet, but how to properly build one as well. Jim's first creation was a hand puppet named Pierre the Rat, which he used in his audition for the Junior Morning Show. Jim's work paid off, and he was offered a position at WTOP, with a starting pay of $5 per episode, or about $70 today when adjusted for inflation. The show, hosted by local television personality Roy Meacham, only aired for 3 weeks. It was quickly canceled for violating child labor laws by employing children under the age of 14. Despite the Junior Morning Show airing for such a short time, a local newspaper writer praised the puppet segments. In Jim's short stint on the show, Meacham grew a fondness for the young man, and he invited Jim to appear on his other WTOP show, Saturday, where Jim would create short skits in which puppets lip-synced to music. Saturday would only last until August of 1954, just as Jim began his first semester of college, but he wouldn't be absent from TV for long. James Kovac, a program director for the local NBC channel, WRC-TV, spotted Jim's talents through his work with Meacham. Kovac would put Jim to work, asking him to perform his puppets on various programs on the station. It was around this time that Jim would first use the term Muppets to describe his creations. For years, it was believed to be a combination of marionette and puppets, but he would later admit that it was just something he made up. Early in his college career, Jim decided to switch his major from production design to home economics, which taught similar skills with a less rigorous course load. Perfect for Jim considering he spent much of his free time performing. Serendipitously, the University of Maryland had decided to add a puppetry class as part of the home economics curriculum. The class was taught by a professor with no experience in puppetry, meaning that Jim, now somewhat known for his stints on local television, had the most experience in the class. This, combined with his abundant confidence and tall stature, is what first caught the eye of 20-year-old Jane Neville. After Jane proved to be a proficient puppeteer in the class, Jim took notice of her as well. The soft-spoken yet commanding freshman approached her, asking if she would be willing to perform with him on some of his programs. She agreed. With the help of an additional talented hand, the two would continue to develop and improve the style of the Muppets, with more elaborate lip-syncing routines and skits. In early 1955, Jim and Jane began performing puppet skits on WRC-TV's new variety program, Afternoon. Despite his success on local TV and healthy compensation for his work, Jim was not content. It might have been self-doubt of his own talents, or it could have been a general disinterest in puppetry as a future career. No matter the reason, Jim shyly begged a reporter at WRC-TV to talk to Kovac for him and convince him to give him a job as a crew member instead of as a performer. The reporter laughed Jim off and encouraged him to stick with puppetry. It might just make him rich. Jim and Jane's segments on Afternoon were so entertaining that it was no surprise that WRC-TV wanted more. However, the offer they extended was more lucrative than they could have realistically hoped. WRC-TV wanted to place Jim and Jane in a 5-minute slot between the evening news and The Tonight Show, where they would exclusively write and perform their Muppet segments. The new duo would not hesitate to accept the offer, and they were excited to play around in their new creative sandbox.
Sam and Friends has been brought to you by SK.
Jim and Jane's new show, Sam and Friends, made its debut on May 9, 1955 on WRC-TV. The show starred a full cast of Muppets, many of which Jim had built for variety shows that he had been working on over the past year. The show's titular star, a puppet named Sam, found his uniqueness in his inflexibility. He had a solid face, unlike many of the other felt puppets on the show. He would only be seen lip-syncing to records, and he was the only human in the show's cast. His friends were much more abstract. There was Yorick, a purple skull with a large appetite, Professor Madcliffe, a rambunctious character that often found himself promoting products in the show's commercials, Chicken Liver, a grumpy character that was disgusted by the immaturity of the rest of the cast, Harry the Hipster, a cool, jazz-loving character that wouldn't be caught without his signature shades, and Kermit, an abstract, lizard-like turquoise monster that seemed to find himself in front of the camera more often than the others. The main members would often wear wigs or outfits, almost as if the characters themselves were performing as another character. In the early days of the show, the skits consisted almost exclusively of the puppets lip-syncing to records. The climax of the formula Jim had developed was the explosive finale. Most of the skits ended with the character getting swallowed alive or blown up. Some viewers were shocked or confused by these endings, but Jim loved them. Over time, the show would add bits of witty humor, painful puns, and genuine sentimentality. The show was supposed to revolve around Sam coping with the struggles of everyday life, often finding solace, if not distraction, in his energetic and wild friends. In the show's world, Sam was the only character that existed in reality, and Kermit, Yorick, and all of his other friends were either figments of his imagination or exaggerated parts of his own inner self. This would be one of the first attempts Jim made to instill a deeper meaning to the Muppet mayhem. The cast of Sam and Friends grew as Jim continued to build more Muppets, with other creatures such as Icky Gunk, Omar, and Mushmelon being added. It is difficult to tell just how large the cast became, or just how many episodes Jim and Jane produced. One shortcoming of the young creator was his lack of foresight in recording his first original series. To be fair, Sam and Friends aired during the age of the kinescope, a device in which a film camera recorded the live television feed in order to play it back. This was necessary without the existence of videotapes. Jim and WRC-TV recorded very few episodes of Sam and Friends, and many of those that were recorded have been lost. Ironically, there is only one publicly available Sam and Friends episode featuring Sam himself, although photos of him appearing in other skits exist and other episodes could be in various archives. More episodes than are viewable have been documented in either TV listings, script form, or picture form. A myriad of episodes have been described from the memories of fans, but even if these skits existed in the way in which they are remembered, it is nearly impossible to tell if the skit in question was shown on Sam and Friends, Afternoon, or the countless other DC area shows that Jim and Jane appeared. Luckily, the most popular skits from Sam and Friends have either been found or have been re-performed by Jim and Jane elsewhere. Audiences were mesmerized by the Muppets. At this point in time, puppets were thought to be exclusive to bouncy marionettes or wooden dolls where only the mouth was able to be manipulated. Jim and Jane subverted this expectation completely. The Muppets could show a wide range of emotions thanks to their malleable shape. For instance, Kermit could display his inner feelings clearly for the audience just by Jim adjusting the placement of his fingers. This purposeful design was necessary for television, which, due to the placement of the camera, tended to be much more intimate than stage puppetry. Early in Sam and Friends production, Jim would place live feed monitors on the studio floor in order to see what the camera was seeing. This greatly helped both his and Jane's performance, and it was a practice that he would keep. Jim also saw an opportunity to change the way children's entertainment was filmed. Up to this point, every puppet show filmed and aired on TV was a production that existed outside of the television medium. The performers would set up their puppet stages on a set, and the TV studio would focus the cameras head-on, framing their stages perfectly into the square boxed frame of the television screen. Sam and Friends would be the first puppet show created for and taking advantage of the new medium of television. Jim didn't need a puppet stage to frame all of the action. The television screen was the puppet stage, and with the flexibility of the television camera, Jim and Jane had a lot more space to perform. For the first time, the puppeteer was not constrained to a tiny stage. Jim's creations could roam free. Each episode of Sam and Friends would be an average of 4 minutes, with the last 60 seconds dedicated to a sponsor, typically SK Meats. Jim and Jane would shoot a short skit to advertise the products using the characters from the main show.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'll try to remain calm as I tell you about the new SK idea in flavor. It's the new SK pork and bacon sausage. It combines the wonderful taste of pure pork sausage with the delicious flavor of hickory smoked quality bacon.
Sam and Friends was an immediate hit. Those tuning in on weeknights loved the unique and funny show, and local newspapers praised the addition to WRC's lineup, with the main complaint being the show's short running time. It was difficult to tell just how many fans Jim and Jane had, but some bad news would give them a rough estimate. In the summer of 1955, just months after Sam and Friends' first episode, WRC canceled the show in order to rearrange their late-night programming block. Immediately after the announcement, angry fans contacted the station until they had no choice but to uncancel the show. This would result in Sam and Friends only airing 3 times a week instead of 5, but Jim and Jane were thrilled to have the ability to continue performing. Sam and Friends would be moved throughout WRC's lineup as the station saw fit, and Jim and Jane's focus shifted toward their work on afternoon during late 1955 and early 1956. Jane had graduated from the University of Maryland and began to pursue her master's at a school in Washington, D.C. She purposely built her schedule in a way to continue working on both afternoon and Sam and Friends, prioritizing puppetry and Jim. Jim was thrilled to have Jane continue her work with him, as she had proven to be the perfect partner. Great things were happening for the young Jim Henson, but a tragedy would distract from the success. On April 15, 1956, a car accident took the life of Jim's brother, Paul Henson Jr. The event devastated both Jim and his parents. Henson biographer Brian J. Jones detailed the lasting impact the loss had on the young creator, describing Jim's repressed sadness over the loss of his brother and the way in which the tragedy motivated Jim's creative work in an unexpected way. Instead of using his sorrow to create dark and gritty material, the loss of his brother only pushed Jim's creations towards zany, colorful, humorous, and above all, optimistic works. Jim would later describe himself as having an unnatural amount of, quote, ridiculous optimism, a trait that those close to him would cherish and that the audience of his shows would gravitate toward. His brother's death had another impact, an acute awareness of his own mortality, a ticking clock. In May of 1956, Jim and Jane would bring the Muppets to yet another WRC show, Footlight Theater, an interstitial between Western films in which the Muppets would interact with the show's host, guitarist Paul Arnold. The work on the show was not their favorite, and with Sam and Friends' unpredictable time slot, it seemed that the duo had hit a wall. However, Jim's creative mind was too big for just the DC market, and he and Jane would have their chance to prove the wide appeal of the Muppets in a big, unexpected way.
I'd like to introduce a couple of people now. Well, I don't know if I use the word people advisedly, but several years ago in Washington, D.C., there were 2 young college students, Jim Henson and Jane Neville. They got together with some little puppets, and they formed what people in Washington now know as the Muppets. A little different than a puppet. And you folks in Washington, D.C. know them very well. They've been appearing there over at WRC-TV for 2.5 years, and they're very big favorites, and we can see why. We had them on our Tonight Show a few weeks ago, and they broke it up, so we're happy to have them with us today. Here are the Muppets.
On October 11, 1956, Jim and Jane would make their first appearance on The Tonight Show with Steve Allen, the show that they regularly preceded in WRC's lineup. Producers of Tonight had caught wind of a peculiar puppet show that was airing before them in Washington, D.C., and they had asked Jim and Jane to audition for the show. They would be brought on to perform a sketch. introducing the Muppets to the entire country for the first time. Jim?
Baby, you don't